Depression doesn't make you weak. It reveals where you've been too strong. Have you ever wondered why the strongest people you know seem to fall the hardest? Why the one who always had it together suddenly can't get out of bed? Why the person everyone leaned on is now the one who's broken? There's something we fundamentally misunderstand about depression. We see it as weakness, as failure, as the moment when someone finally couldn't handle life anymore. But what if I told you that depression is often the psyche's last-ditch effort to save you from a strength that's become your prison? What if the breakdown isn't a collapse at all, but a breakthrough that's been desperately needed for years? Consider this. You've spent your entire life being strong. Strong for your family, strong for your friends. Strong through loss, through disappointment, through every moment when falling apart would have been the natural thing to do. You've held yourself together with such fierce determination that you've forgotten what it feels like to simply be, and then one day, without warning, you can't do it anymore. The strength that defined you evaporates. You feel like you've failed at the one thing you were good at, being strong. But here's the truth that Jung understood, and that our culture has forgotten. Sometimes the psyche must destroy the walls we've built in order to set us free. Let me tell you about someone. Let's call her Sarah. Sarah was the capable one, the one who handled everything. She was the eldest daughter who raised her siblings when her mother fell ill. She was the employee who never missed a deadline, never complained, never asked for help. She was the friend who always had time to listen, always knew the right thing to say, always showed up when someone needed her. Sarah's strength wasn't just a quality she possessed. It became her identity. It was the armor she wore so constantly that she forgot there was skin underneath. People admired her, they relied on her, they told her how inspiring she was, how together she had it all. And Sarah smiled and nodded and added another weight to the load she was already carrying. Then, at 37, Sarah woke up one morning and couldn't move. Not physically, though her body felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, but psychologically. The thought of getting out of bed, of putting on that armor one more time, of being strong for one more day, felt impossible. Not difficult, impossible. The depression that followed wasn't gradual, it was totalizing, and what confused Sarah most was that nothing particularly terrible had happened. No trauma, no crisis, no obvious trigger. Just this sudden, complete inability to be the person she'd always been. She felt weak. She felt ashamed. She felt like she was failing everyone who'd ever counted on her. But what Sarah couldn't see, what most of us can't see when we're in the depths, is that depression wasn't attacking her strength. It was attacking the prison her strength had become. Think about this for a moment. We live in a culture that worships strength, resilience, grit, the ability to keep going no matter what. We celebrate people who power through and push past their limits and never give up. We've created entire industries around optimization, productivity, and mental toughness. And there's nothing inherently wrong with strength. Strength is necessary. Strength is valuable. But here's what we don't talk about. Strength can become a defense mechanism, a way to avoid feeling, a method of control in a world that feels uncontrollable. And when strength becomes the only way you know how to exist, when vulnerability becomes unthinkable and rest becomes impossible, your psyche has only one option left. It breaks you, not to destroy you, but to save you from destroying yourself. Consider the metaphor of a tree that only grows upward, that only focuses on height and never on depth, becomes unstable. Its roots remain shallow. The first strong wind that comes along will topple it, no matter how tall it's grown. But a tree that's been through storms, that's had branches broken, that's been forced to grow roots deep into the earth, that tree survives. Depression is often that storm, not a random act of meteorological violence, but a necessary force that exposes where your foundation has been too shallow, where your growth has been too one-dimensional, where your strength has been compensating for something you've refused to look at. Most people experiencing depression focus on the obvious suffering, the fatigue, the emptiness, the loss of pleasure, the crushing weight of simply existing. These symptoms are real and debilitating, but they're also symptoms, manifestations of something deeper happening in the psyche. They're the fever that indicates the immune system is fighting an infection. Unpleasant, yes, but also potentially necessary. What Jung understood, and what depth psychology reveals, is that the psyche is always moving toward wholeness. Always, even when it looks like disintegration, even when it feels like dying, the unconscious is attempting to restore balance. And if you've spent years, decades perhaps, living in a state of profound imbalance, where strength has crowded out every other aspect of your being, the restoration of balance is going to feel like destruction, because in a sense it is. It's the destruction of a false self that's become unsustainable. Think about all the things that strength protects you from: grief, fear, helplessness, dependency, vulnerability, uncertainty. These aren't pleasant states, which is why we develop strength to avoid them. But they're also fundamentally human states. They're part of the full spectrum of existence. And when you've spent years being strong specifically to not feel these things, they don't disappear. They accumulate in the unconscious, gathering power, waiting. Depression often arrives when the accumulated weight of unfelt feelings becomes too much for even your strength to contain. The dam breaks, and suddenly you're flooded with everything you've been too strong to feel. This is why depression can feel so overwhelming, so all-consuming. You're not just experiencing present sadness or current stress. You're experiencing years of deferred grief, suppressed fear, unacknowledged exhaustion. You're feeling everything you were too strong to feel when it was happening. Carl Jung spent much of his career studying the psyche's compensation mechanisms, the ways our unconscious attempts to restore balance when our conscious attitude becomes too one-sided. He understood that the psyche operates according to a principle he called enantiodromia, a Greek term meaning running counter to. This principle states that everything, when taken to its extreme, transforms into its opposite. Strength, when taken to its extreme, doesn't just diminish, it inverts into profound weakness. Not because strength itself is bad, but because any psychic content that becomes too dominant inevitably triggers a compensatory reaction from the unconscious. Jung would say that someone like Sarah, someone who has identified completely with strength, capability, and self-reliance, has created what he called a one-sided conscious attitude. The persona, the social mask we present to the world, has become rigid and totalizing. There's no room for anything that doesn't fit the image of strength. No space for vulnerability, for neediness, for simply being human in messy, imperfect ways. But here's the crucial insight. Everything that doesn't fit into the persona gets relegated to what Jung called the shadow. The shadow isn't just our dark side, or our evil impulses. It's everything we've rejected about ourselves, everything we've deemed unacceptable, whether because our family, our culture, or our own ego couldn't tolerate it. For someone who's identified with strength, the shadow contains all the vulnerable, weak, needy, helpless parts of themselves. It contains the child who wanted to be taken care of, the adolescent who felt overwhelmed and scared, the adult who desperately needs rest but doesn't know how to stop. All of these rejected parts accumulate in the unconscious, forming what Jung called complexes, emotionally charged psychic content that has its own energy, its own agenda. Depression, from this Jungian perspective, is often what happens when the shadow can no longer be contained. When the rejected parts of ourselves become so powerful, so insistent on being acknowledged, that they essentially stage a coup. They overthrow the ego's tyrannical rule of strength and force consciousness to confront everything it's been avoiding. This is why depression often feels like you're being taken over by something foreign, something not you. In a sense, you are. You're being confronted with all the parts of yourself you've spent years or decades refusing to acknowledge. The weakness you've denied, the vulnerability you've rejected, the need for help you've deemed unacceptable. Jung called this process the confrontation with the shadow, and he considered it essential for what he termed individuation, the lifelong process of becoming whole, of integrating all aspects of yourself into a unified self that's more complete, more authentic, more truly you than the persona you've been presenting to the world. The journey of individuation isn't comfortable. Jung was clear about this. He wrote about the descent into the unconscious, the dark night of the soul, the necessity of psychic death before rebirth can occur. He understood that real transformation requires us to die to our old ways of being, to release our grip on the identities we've constructed, to surrender the control we've been desperately maintaining. Depression, through this lens, isn't a pathology to be eliminated as quickly as possible. It's a call to transformation. It's the psyche's way of saying, the way you've been living is no longer viable. Something fundamental must change. This doesn't mean depression should be romanticized, or that suffering is inherently redemptive. Jung wasn't naive about the dangers of depression, the risk of suicide, the potential for the psyche to fragment beyond repair. But he also understood that if we only focus on symptom removal, if we only want to return to normal as quickly as possible, we miss the opportunity for the deep transformation that the depression is demanding. Jung spoke often about the concept of the self, not the ego, but the deeper center of the total personality, both conscious and unconscious. The self is always working toward wholeness, toward the integration of opposites, toward a more complete expression of who you are. The ego, your conscious identity, the I, you think of as yourself, is just a small part of the total psyche. When the ego's agenda diverges too far from the self's agenda, when your conscious way of living violates the deeper needs of your total being, the self intervenes, sometimes gently through dreams, symptoms, or intuitions. But if those gentle messages are ignored, if you're too strong to listen, then the intervention becomes more forceful. Depression can be that forceful intervention. The self essentially immobilizes the ego, strips it of its defenses, and forces a confrontation with everything that's been ignored. Your strength has made you unconscious to your deeper needs. Depression makes you so conscious of your vulnerability that you can't ignore it anymore. Jung also understood the role of what he called active imagination, a method of consciously engaging with unconscious content. In depression, this often happens involuntarily. You're forced to sit with your inner experience, to face the thoughts and feelings you've been too busy being strong to notice. The rumination that characterizes depression, as painful as it is, can also be the psyche's attempt to process everything that's been repressed. The collective unconscious, Jung's term for the shared, inherited psychological structures that all humans possess, contains archetypes of wounding and healing. The archetype of the wounded healer suggests that our deepest wounds, when consciously integrated, become sources of wisdom and healing power. But first, we must acknowledge the wound. We must stop being so strong that we pretend we were never hurt. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche wrote, "That which does not kill us makes us stronger." It's become a cultural cliché, a motivational platitude. But Nietzsche's actual philosophy was far more nuanced, far darker than that single quote suggests. He understood that strength could become its own form of weakness, what he called ressentiment, a poisonous strength that's actually rooted in the denial of one's own powerlessness. Nietzsche also wrote about the necessity of amor fati, the love of one's fate, including all its suffering. Not the grit, your teeth endurance of suffering, but an actual acceptance, even embrace of the totality of your experience. This requires a fundamentally different relationship to strength. Not strength as control or invulnerability, but strength as the capacity to be present to whatever arises, including your own weakness. The existential philosophers understood something crucial about human existence. We are fundamentally vulnerable beings in a world we don't fully control. The existential anxiety that Kierkegaard wrote about, the dread that comes from confronting our own freedom and responsibility, is something we all carry. We develop various ways of avoiding this anxiety, what the existentialists called bad faith, living inauthentically to escape the burden of freedom. Strength can be a form of bad faith, a way of pretending we're not vulnerable, not dependent, not fundamentally fragile beings who will all eventually die. We construct an identity around being strong specifically to avoid confronting these existential realities. Depression tears away that pretense. It forces an encounter with vulnerability, with mortality, with the limits of control. It's existential exposure, the removal of all the comfortable illusions we've been using to avoid confronting the fundamental conditions of existence. Martin Heidegger wrote about thrownness, the fact that we're thrown into existence without choosing our circumstances, our bodies, our fundamental situation. We spend much of our lives trying to deny this thrownness, trying to create the illusion that we're in control, that we're self-sufficient. Strength becomes part of this illusion, but depression returns us to the experience of thrownness. We're forced to confront that we didn't choose this suffering, we can't control it. We're at the mercy of forces larger than our individual will. This is terrifying. It's also potentially liberating. Because once you stop pretending you're in complete control, once you stop maintaining the exhausting fiction of total self-sufficiency, you can actually begin to live authentically. You can ask for help. You can admit you're struggling. You can be vulnerable with others in ways that create real connection rather than the shallow interactions that occur when everyone's wearing armor. Eastern philosophy offers another perspective on this dynamic. Buddhism teaches that suffering arises from attachment, including attachment to a fixed idea of who we are. The concept of anatta, or no self, suggests that the solid, unchanging identity we take ourselves to be is actually an illusion. We're constantly changing, constantly in flux. When we identify too strongly with any quality, including strength, we create suffering because we're trying to fix something that's naturally fluid. We're trying to be strong all the time, in all situations, regardless of what's actually needed or appropriate. This creates a fundamental misalignment with reality. Depression, from a Buddhist perspective, might be seen as the painful dissolution of a false identity. The ego, structure built around strength, is revealed as impermanent, as unable to provide the security we thought it offered. This dissolution is painful because we've mistaken that structure for our true self. But the dissolution isn't the problem. The attachment was. The Taoist concept of Wu Wei, or effortless action, points to a different kind of strength, one that doesn't involve force or control, but rather alignment with the natural flow of things. This requires knowing when to act and when to yield, when to be strong and when to be soft. Someone who can only be strong has lost this natural wisdom. They're like a rigid tree that breaks in the wind rather than bending with it. Depression can be understood as what happens when we've been forcing ourselves against the natural grain for too long. We've been trying to control what can't be controlled, to be strong in situations that required softness, to push forward when we needed to rest. The psyche finally forces us to stop, to yield, to admit defeat. The mystical traditions, both Eastern and Western, speak of the dark night of the soul, a period of spiritual crisis where all previous certainties dissolve and we're left in a void of meaning and connection. St. John of the Cross described this as a necessary stage on the path to divine union. The old self must die before the true self can emerge. This isn't metaphorical death. It feels like actual dying. Depression often carries this quality, a sense that something fundamental is ending, that you're disappearing, that there will be nothing left. And in a sense, this intuition is correct. The person you thought you were, the identity built on strength and capability, is dying. It must die. It's become a prison. The philosophical question becomes, who are you without your strength? If strength has been the foundation of your identity, its loss feels like annihilation. But perhaps that's because you've mistaken a quality for your essence. You've confused what you do being strong with what you are. Depression forces this question. It strips away all the qualities you've identified with and asks, what remains? Who are you when you can't perform, can't achieve, can't maintain the persona you've constructed? This is a terrifying question. It's also a profound opportunity. So what does this understanding mean for someone actually experiencing depression? How does this perspective translate into lived experience, into the daily reality of not being able to get out of bed, of feeling empty, of struggling through each moment? First, it means recognizing that your depression might be trying to tell you something, not in a simplistic everything happens for a reason way, but in the sense that symptoms have meaning. Your inability to be strong anymore isn't random. It's not just a chemical malfunction, even if neurochemistry is part of the picture. It's a response to a way of living that's become unsustainable. You might notice that your depression is most acute when you're trying to force yourself to be strong, when you're attempting to return to normal, to be the person you were, to meet everyone's expectations. The depression intensifies because you're working against its message rather than listening to it. This doesn't mean giving up, surrendering to despair, or using depression as an excuse. It means developing a different relationship to the experience. Instead of seeing depression as an enemy to defeat with strength, you begin to see it as a communication from parts of yourself that have been silenced. Start paying attention to when the depression began, not just the immediate trigger, but the longer timeline. Often, if you trace it back, you'll find that depression arrived when you'd been strong for too long. After you handled a crisis, after you successfully completed something demanding, after you'd proven yourself, once again, to be capable. The timing isn't coincidental. The psyche waits until you're safe to fall apart. Or more accurately, it can finally express what's been building once the immediate crisis has passed. This is why breakdowns often happen after the worst is over. The unconscious has been holding everything together until there's space for the breakdown to occur. This shows up in your life as sudden inability to do things that were once easy, not because you've lost the skills or capacity, but because the motivational structure that was driving those behaviors has collapsed. You can't force yourself to care about things you've been forcing yourself to care about. The engine of willpower that's been running your life has simply stopped. When you begin to see this pattern, you can start asking different questions. Not how do I get my strength back, but what was my strength protecting me from? Not how do I return to normal, but what aspects of normal were unsustainable? The first step is recognizing that rest isn't weakness. This sounds simple, but for someone who's identified with strength, it's revolutionary. Rest isn't preparation for more productivity. Rest isn't something you have to earn. Rest is a fundamental human need that you've been denying, and your psyche is now demanding it by force. Allow yourself to rest without guilt. This is harder than it sounds. Your mind will tell you that you're being lazy, that you should be doing something, that rest is acceptable only if you're resting in order to become productive again. Notice these thoughts. They're the voice of the old structure, the persona of strength trying to reassert control. You might also notice a profound fear emerging as you stop being strong. Fear of who you are without that identity. Fear of being seen as weak. Fear of losing respect, love, or value in others' eyes. This fear is real and valid. And it's also revealing something important about the conditional nature of how you've been relating to yourself and others. Have you only valued yourself when you were strong? Have the people in your life only valued you for what you could do for them? These are painful questions, but depression forces you to confront them. As you sit with this experience, and sitting with it is often all you can do, begin to notice the parts of yourself that have been forbidden. The needy part, the scared part, the part that wants someone else to take care of things for a while. These aren't character flaws. They're human needs that you've been labeling as weaknesses and rejecting. The integration process involves developing a relationship with these rejected parts. Jung's technique of active imagination can be useful here. When you notice yourself condemning your own weakness, imagine that weakness as a person or figure. What would it look like? What would it say if you asked it what it needed? This might feel silly or artificial at first, but it's a way of creating space for parts of yourself that have only been able to express through symptoms. The depression itself might have something to say if you stopped treating it only as an enemy. Warning signs that you're still operating from the old pattern. You view depression as a problem to solve with strength. You're angry at yourself for being depressed. You're trying to hide your depression from others. You're counting the days until you can get back to normal. You're using whatever energy you have to maintain appearances rather than to heal. Signs that integration is beginning. You can admit you're struggling. You can ask for help without shame. You can rest without guilt. You can say no to demands that you don't have capacity for. You can tolerate others seeing you as less than perfectly strong. You can feel your feelings rather than analyzing your way around them. This process isn't linear. You'll have days where you feel like you're making progress, where the depression lifts slightly, where you glimpse a different way of being. Then you'll have days where you're right back in the depths, where it all feels hopeless again. This is normal. Integration happens in waves, not in a straight line. What emerges on the other side of this descent isn't the old you with depression removed. It's a fundamentally different relationship to yourself and to life. You're no longer divided between the acceptable strong self and the rejected weak self. You've integrated the opposites. You've become more whole, even if, especially if, that wholeness includes your brokenness. This integrated self knows how to be strong when strength is needed, but also how to be vulnerable when vulnerability is appropriate. You've developed what we might call flexible strength, the ability to adapt to circumstances rather than rigidly maintaining one posture regardless of what's actually required. You've also developed depth. The person you were before depression may have been successful, functional, admirable. But there was something missing, a dimension of human experience you were cut off from. You couldn't really understand suffering because you wouldn't let yourself suffer. You couldn't really connect with others in their pain because you couldn't acknowledge your own. Depression forces you into that depth. And while the journey is agonizing, what you bring back from the depths is invaluable. Compassion, born from understanding your own vulnerability. Wisdom, born from facing what you've been avoiding. Authenticity, born from no longer being able to maintain the persona. The contrast is striking. Before, maintaining control, managing image, performing strength, avoiding vulnerability, staying busy to avoid feeling. After, allowing life to unfold, being genuine even when imperfect, being strong and vulnerable as circumstances require, creating space for feeling, tolerating stillness. But here's what's important to understand. This transformation doesn't mean you'll never feel depressed again. It doesn't mean you've solved depression and can now return to pushing yourself without limits. The psyche's need for balance is ongoing. If you slip back into one-sidedness, if you start over-identifying with strength again, the compensation will return. Depression teaches you to pay attention to the signals before they become overwhelming, to notice when you're over-functioning, over-giving, over-performing, to course correct before the psyche has to forcibly shut you down. This is why Jung emphasized individuation as a lifelong process, not a destination you reach. You're continually called to integrate new aspects of yourself, to release identifications that have become limiting, to die and be reborn in small ways throughout your life. The transformation also affects your relationships. When you're no longer hiding your vulnerability, when you've integrated your weakness as much as your strength, you become capable of deeper intimacy. You can meet others in their humanity rather than just in your capable helper role. You can receive as well as give. You can be in relationship as a whole person rather than as a persona. There's often a grieving process involved. Grief for the years spent living partially, for the energy expended maintaining an unsustainable way of being, for the connections that were lost because you couldn't let anyone see you struggling. This grief is appropriate. Honor it. But there's also a strange kind of gratitude that can emerge. Not gratitude for the suffering itself, but for what the suffering revealed, for the transformation it forced, for the person you've become through facing what you'd been avoiding. You wouldn't choose to go through depression again, but you also wouldn't trade what you've learned for a return to comfortable unconsciousness. The integrated self lives with a kind of paradox. Stronger because you've accepted your weakness, more capable because you've acknowledged your limitations, more authentic because you've stopped pretending, more connected because you've stopped isolating yourself in your strength. This is what Jung meant by the union of opposites. Not choosing one pole over another, not replacing strength with weakness or control with chaos, but holding both, being able to access both, recognizing that wholeness requires the full spectrum of human capacity. Remember Sarah from the beginning of this exploration. She eventually came to understand that her depression wasn't the failure of her strength, but its transformation. The person she'd been, the one who could handle everything, who never needed help, who existed primarily to support others, had to die so that a more complete person could emerge. She's not as productive as she used to be. She says no more often. She rests without guilt. She asks for help when she needs it. She lets people see her struggling. By conventional measures, she might seem less strong. but she'll tell you she's never been stronger. Because real strength isn't the ability to endure anything without breaking. Real strength is the flexibility to bend without breaking, the wisdom to know when to yield, the courage to be vulnerable, the capacity to be fully human. Depression didn't make Sarah weak. It revealed where she'd been too strong for too long. It forced the integration that her psyche had been demanding. It broke down the walls she'd built around her heart and let her finally, fully, feel what it means to be alive. The pain and the joy, the weakness and the strength, the falling apart and the coming together again. Your depression may be doing the same for you, not punishing you, not revealing your inadequacy, but desperately trying to restore balance to a life that's become unsustainable. The strength that's abandoning you now may be the very strength that was suffocating you. What lies on the other side of this dark passage isn't the return to who you were. It's the possibility of becoming who you actually are beneath the persona, beneath the performance, beneath the exhausting maintenance of an image of invulnerability. The journey through depression is a descent, yes, but as Jung knew, as the myths have always told us, the descent is how we find what's most valuable. The treasure is in the cave we fear to enter. The wisdom is in the darkness we've been avoiding. The wholeness we seek is found by integrating precisely what we've been rejecting. So if you're in the depths right now, if you can't be strong anymore, if the persona has shattered and you don't know who you are without it, know this: the falling apart might be the most important thing you ever do. The weakness you're experiencing might be the doorway to a strength you've never known. The death you're dying might be giving birth to a life more authentic than any you've lived before. This is the paradox at the heart of transformation. We must be broken open to become whole. We must lose ourselves to find ourselves. We must die to who we thought we were to discover who we actually are. Your depression isn't making you weak. It's revealing where you've been strong in all the wrong ways, for all the wrong reasons, at too high a cost. Listen to what it's trying to tell you. Not with your mind, which will want to fix and control and return to normal, but with the deeper wisdom of your total being, which knows that something fundamental must change. The transformation is happening. It looks like falling apart because the structure that was holding you together was too small, too rigid, too partial. What's emerging, if you can trust the process, if you can surrender the old ways, if you can let yourself be remade, is a self that's vast enough to contain all of you. The strong and the weak, the capable and the vulnerable, the light and the shadow. This is the invitation depression offers. Not to be cured, but to be transformed. Not to return to normal, but to discover that normal was never sustainable. Not to become strong again in the old way, but to find a new relationship to strength, one that includes, rather than excludes, your full humanity. The darkness you're in isn't the end. It's the beginning.